The morning mist hung low over Westminster Abbey as security teams made their final checks. Inside the ancient walls, florists adjusted the last of the white roses, while camera crews tested their equipment one more time.
Oh.
The world was about to witness something that hadn't happened in over 70 years. Coronation that would change the British monarchy forever. Prince William stood before the mirror in his private chambers, his reflection showing a man who had carried the weight of destiny since birth. The ceremonial robes lay carefully arranged on the nearby chair, each piece steeped in centuries of tradition. His wife Catherine moved quietly around the room, ensuring everything was perfect for this historic day. The golden crown that would soon rest upon his head had been worn by his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II, for decades. Now it waited in the abbey, surrounded by other precious regalia that told the story of British history. William's hands trembled slightly as he fastened the ceremonial sword to his belt. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the future of an institution that millions around the world looked to for stability. Outside, thousands of people had gathered along the streets of London, many camping overnight to secure the best viewing spots. Flags waved in the gentle breeze, while street vendors sold commemorative items to excited tourists. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation, but also tinged with the bittersweet knowledge that this day marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. In the Abbey, representatives from around the world took their seats. Presidents, prime ministers, and royal family members from distant shores had traveled to witness this moment. The Archbishop of Canterbury reviewed his notes one final time, knowing that every word he spoke would be remembered for generations to come. William's children had been prepared for months for this day. They understood that their father was about to become something different, something more than just their dad. The young prince and princess sat quietly with their mother, dressed in their finest clothes. Trying to comprehend the magnitude of what was about to unfold, the prince's mind wandered to his late mother, Princess Diana, and how proud she would have been to see this moment. He touched the ring he wore, a gift from Catherine that contained a small diamond from his mother's collection. Diana's spirit felt present in the abbey, watching over her son as he prepared to accept the crown she never got to see him wear. As the final minutes ticked away, William took a deep breath and looked out the window at the crowds below. These were his people now, not just as a prince, but as their future king. The responsibility was overwhelming, but he had been preparing for this his entire life. His father, King Charles, had taught him well, and now it was time to step forward. Into his destiny, the bells of Westminster Abbey began to chime, their ancient sound echoing across London and marking the beginning of a ceremony that would be watched by billions around the world. This was more than just a crowning. It was a promise, a commitment, and a moment that would define not just William's future, but the future of the monarchy itself. The doors to the abbey slowly opened, and Prince William knew there was no turning back. History was calling, and he was ready to answer. The processional music began to fill Westminster Abbey as Prince William made his way down the ancient aisle. Each step echoed through the sacred space, where kings and queens had been crowned for nearly 1,000 years. The weight of history seemed to press down on his shoulders, but his stride remained steady and purposeful. Catherine walked behind him, her own ceremonial dress flowing gracefully with each measured step. She had been his anchor through years of preparation for this moment, and her presence gave him strength. The children followed, their young faces serious as they understood the importance of the day. Even if they couldn't fully grasp its meaning, the congregation rose as one, a collective breath seeming to pause as the future king approached. The altar. Among the faces in the crowd, William could see his military colleagues, childhood friends, and dignitaries from around the world. But it was the ordinary citizens in the front rows, teachers, nurses, volunteers, who reminded him why this ceremony mattered so much. King Charles III watched his son with a mixture of pride and emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. He remembered his own coronation, the nervous energy, the weight of the crown, both literal and metaphorical. Now, He was witnessing his son take the same solemn steps, continuing a tradition that stretched back through centuries of British history. The Archbishop of Canterbury stepped forward, his voice carrying clearly through the abbey as he began the ancient words of the coronation ceremony. Each phrase had been spoken countless times before, but today they felt fresh and meaningful. The promises William was about to make would bind him to a life of service that would last until his final breath. Television cameras captured every moment, broadcasting the ceremony to living rooms, pubs, and public squares around the world. In Australia, families gathered around their screens in the early morning hours. In Canada, communities organized viewing parties in town halls. The Commonwealth nations watched with particular interest, knowing that this man would soon be there. King 2 social media buzzed with real-time reactions as people shared their thoughts and emotions. Hashtags about the coronation trended worldwide. Millions of posts showing support, curiosity, and sometimes skepticism about the ancient institution adapting to the modern world. But even critics found themselves drawn to the spectacle. And tradition on display. In the abbey, William knelt before the altar as the archbishop began the anointing ceremony. The holy oil, prepared according to a recipe that dated back centuries, was applied to his hands, chest, and head. This was the most sacred part of the ceremony, the moment when a man was transformed into a monarch by divine blessing and human tradition. The St. Edward's crown was lifted from its cushion, catching the light that streamed through the abbey's stained glass windows, crafted of solid gold and adorned with precious stones. It weighed nearly 5 pounds, a physical reminder of the burden William was about to accept. The archbishop raised it high above William's head as the congregation held its collective breath. As the crown was lowered onto William's head, something unexpected happened. A single tear rolled down his cheek, visible to the millions watching around the world. It wasn't a tear of sadness, but of overwhelming emotion, grief for his grandmother who should have been there to see this moment, gratitude for the path that led him here, and determination to serve his people with honor. The moment was captured by photographers, would later become one of the most iconic images of the day. That single tear spoke volumes about the man behind the crown, showing his humanity in the midst of an ancient ritual. It reminded everyone watching that beneath the ceremonial robes and golden crown was a son, a husband, a father, and a human being accepting an extraordinary responsibility. The tear that had rolled down King William's cheek during his crowning became the moment that defined the entire ceremony. News anchors around the world paused their commentary, recognizing that they had witnessed something profoundly human in the midst of an ancient ritual. The image spread across social media within minutes, with people sharing their own emotional reactions to seeing their new king so moved. In living rooms across Britain, families found themselves unexpectedly emotional. Elderly viewers who had watched Queen Elizabeth's coronation as children felt a connection spanning generations. Young people who had never paid attention to the royal family suddenly understood that this wasn't just about tradition, it was about a man accepting a lifetime of service to millions of people he would never meet. The congregation in Westminster Abbey remained silent as the final blessings were pronounced. Even those who had attended countless royal ceremonies admitted later that this felt different. The combination of ancient tradition and genuine emotion created an atmosphere that transcended political opinions about the monarchy. This was about witnessing history, and everyone present knew they would remember this moment for the rest of their lives. Catherine watched her husband from her seat nearby, her own eyes glistening with unshed tears. She had seen him in many roles: as a search and rescue pilot, as a father to their children, as a son grieving his grandmother's death. But watching him accept the crown and all it represented showed her a side of William she had never seen before. The weight of his new responsibility was visible on his shoulders, but so was his resolve to carry it with dignity. The children sat perfectly still, their training in royal protocol evident in their behavior, but even they seemed to sense that something extraordinary was happening. The youngest occasionally glanced at the cameras, aware that the world was watching their family at this pivotal moment. Years later, they would look back on this day as the moment their childhood truly ended and their lives as working royals began. King Charles observed the ceremony with complex emotions. pride in his son's composure and dignity mixed with his own memories of becoming king after his mother's death. The transition had been swift and necessary, but today's ceremony represented something more deliberate and celebratory. This was not just about duty, but about hope for the future of the institution he had inherited. Around the Commonwealth, reaction was immediate and largely positive. In Canada, Prime Minister offices released statements of support and congratulations. Australian Republicans, who had long called for independence from the monarchy, found themselves grudgingly impressed by the dignity of the ceremony. New Zealand's Maori communities, who had their own complex relationship with the crown, watched with interest to see how this new king might approach their concerns. The international diplomatic community paid close attention to every detail of the ceremony. The guest list, the seating arrangements, and the ceremonial protocols all sent messages about Britain's place in the world and its future relationships with other nations. Foreign ministers and ambassadors would spend weeks analyzing the subtle diplomatic signals embedded in the day's events. Back in the Abbey, as the ceremony moved toward its conclusion, William stood to face his people for the first time as their crowned king. The weight of the crown on his head was nothing compared to the weight of expectation. He could feel from the hundreds of people before him and the millions watching around the world. But as he looked out at the congregation, he found strength in their faces and hope in their presence. The moment of that single tear continued to resonate beyond the walls of the Abbey. It had humanized an institution that many saw as distant and outdated. Social media posts from around the world showed people admitting they had been moved to tears themselves, creating a shared emotional experience that crossed cultural and national boundaries. In that one moment, William had connected with his future subjects in a way that no speech or royal tour could have achieved. As King William V turned to face his people for the first time with the crown upon his head, the silence in Westminster Abbey was broken by something unexpected: spontaneous applause. It began with a single person in the congregation and quickly spread throughout the ancient building. This wasn't planned in the centuries-old protocol, but it felt absolutely right in the moment. The Archbishop of Canterbury smiled, recognizing that sometimes the most meaningful parts of great ceremonies are those that happen naturally. The applause wasn't just for the new king, but for the moment itself, for the continuation of a tradition that had weathered world wars, social revolutions, and technological changes that would have been unimaginable to previous generations. Of monarchs outside the Abbey, the crowds that had waited for hours in the London streets erupted in cheers. The sound of celebration echoed off the ancient buildings, creating a symphony of joy that seemed to lift the very stones of the city. Street vendors abandoned their posts to join in the celebration, and even the traditionally reserved British police officers were seen smiling and clapping along with the crowds. Television producers around the world made split-second decisions to extend their coverage, recognizing that they were witnessing something special. The planned commentary was abandoned as anchors simply watched the unfolding emotion with their viewers. In newsrooms from New York to Tokyo, editors scrambled to capture the magnitude of what was happening. Not just a coronation, but a moment of genuine human connection. The new king's first words as a crowned monarch were simple but powerful. Speaking without notes, he thanked the people for their presence and their patience, acknowledging that he understood the trust they were placing in him. His voice carried clearly through the Abbey's ancient acoustics, reaching every person in the building and through television and radio, every corner of the globe in the royal box. Queen Camilla watched with maternal pride as the man she had known since he was a young boy accepted the responsibilities of kingship. She had seen him grow from a sometimes rebellious teenager into a dedicated public servant. And today she witnessed his final transformation into the role he was born to fulfill. Her own journey to this moment had been complex and sometimes controversial, but today was about the future, not the past. The ceremony's most moving moment came when William walked down from the altar to where his children sat. In a gesture not seen in previous coronations, he knelt beside each of them, speaking quietly in words that the microphones couldn't capture, but that clearly meant everything to his family. The images of the newly crowned king at eye level with his children would become some of the most treasured. Photographs of the day, international reaction was swift and largely positive. World leaders who had initially been skeptical about attending a ceremony they viewed as outdated found themselves genuinely moved by what they had witnessed. The president of France later described the experience as profoundly human, while the German chancellor spoke of the dignity and emotion that had defined the day. Social media metrics showed that the coronation was becoming one of the most watched events in television history. But more importantly, for the monarchy's future, the engagement wasn't just from older viewers who might be expected to follow royal events. Young people around the world were sharing clips of the ceremony, particularly the moment of William's tear and his interaction with his children in the hours following the ceremony. Polling organizations reported a significant uptick in support for the monarchy, particularly among younger demographics who had previously shown little interest. In the royal family, the authenticity of William's emotion had resonated in an age where political and public figures were often seen as calculating and artificial. The procession from Westminster Abbey to Buckingham Palace became a celebration that spanned the length of central London. The newly crowned king and his family traveled in the Golden State coach, but their journey was punctuated by stops to greet well-wishers and accept flowers from children who had waited hours for this moment. Each interaction reinforced the impression that this was a monarch who understood the human side of his role. As the procession neared Buckingham Palace, the crowds grew thicker and more enthusiastic. The balcony appearance, a tradition dating back generations, would provide the final image of a day that had already exceeded everyone's expectations. The palace staff, who had witnessed many royal occasions, admitted later that the atmosphere felt different, more hopeful, more connected, more genuine than they had experienced in years. The Golden State coach rolled through the gates of Buckingham Palace as thousands of people pressed against the barriers, hoping for one final glimpse of their new king. The famous balcony, where generations of royals had appeared at moments of national celebration, awaited what would become the defining image of King William's coronation day. Inside the palace, the newly crowned king took a moment to collect himself before the final public appearance. The crown had been temporarily removed, giving him relief from its physical weight, but the emotional weight of the day's events was still settling on his shoulders. Staff members who had served the royal family for decades noted how different. He seemed more grounded, more purposeful, as if the ceremony had crystallized his sense of mission. Catherine helped adjust his ceremonial robes one final time. Their private moment, a stark contrast to the very public nature of everything else. That day, she whispered something in his ear that made him smile, the first genuine, relaxed expression anyone had seen from him since the morning began. Their children, still in their formal clothes, but showing signs of the long day's fatigue, gathered. Around their parents, the crowds outside had been waiting for hours, but their energy hadn't diminished. If anything, the excitement had built throughout the day as news of the ceremony's emotional moments spread through the crowd via smartphones and word of mouth. People who hadn't planned to come to London found themselves drawn to the palace, creating one of the largest spontaneous gatherings in the capital's recent history. News helicopters circled overhead, their cameras capturing the sea of people that stretched from the palace gates all the way to Parliament. International broadcasters estimated that over 1 million people had come to central London for the coronation, far exceeding the expected numbers. Hotel rooms were booked solid, restaurants ran out of food, and public transportation struggled to handle the unprecedented crowds. When the palace doors finally opened, and the royal family stepped onto the famous balcony, the roar from the crowd was deafening. King William V appeared first, still wearing his ceremonial robes, but now with a more relaxed bearing. The crown had been replaced with a smaller, more comfortable diadem that caught the afternoon light beautifully as he waved to his people, the moment that would be replayed on news. Broadcasts for years to come happened when the youngest royal child, overwhelmed by the noise and spectacle, began to cry. Without hesitation, King William knelt down and lifted the child into his arms, whispering comfort while continuing to acknowledge the crowd. the image of the newly crowned monarch comforting his child, while wearing the symbols of his office perfectly captured the balance he would need to maintain. Throughout his reign, Catherine joined her husband at the balcony's edge, and together, they presented a picture of a modern royal family that felt both regal and relatable. The older children waved enthusiastically to the crowd, their earlier solemnity replaced by genuine excitement at seeing so many people gathered in their honor. The family's natural affection for each other was evident in every gesture and glance. The traditional flyover by the Royal Air Force provided a spectacular finale to the balcony appearance. Fighter jets and transport aircraft, including some that William had flown during his military service, streaked overhead in perfect formation. The new king's face lit up with genuine pleasure as he recognized aircraft types he had piloted. Momentarily forgetting the formality of the occasion, to point them out to his children, international observers noted how different this coronation had felt from previous royal ceremonies. The combination of ancient tradition and genuine emotion had created something that felt both timeless and thoroughly contemporary. Diplomatic cables sent from London that evening described the day as a masterclass in soft power and praised the British monarchy's ability to evolve while maintaining its essential character. The social media response continued to build throughout the evening. The hashtag for the coronation became the most used tag in Twitter's history, with people from around the world sharing their emotional reactions to the day's events. Many posts focused on how the ceremony had exceeded their expectations and changed their perception of the monarchy's relevance in the modern world. As the sun began to set over London, the crowd slowly began to disperse, but many lingered, reluctant to let the day end. Street cleaners would later report finding thousands of flowers, cards, and small gifts left behind by well-wishers, tributes to a day that had touched people in ways they hadn't expected. The coronation had succeeded not just as a ceremony, but as a moment of national and international unity. As evening fell over London, the last of the coronation guests departed Westminster Abbey, but the impact of the day's events was just beginning to be understood. In newsrooms around the world, editors and producers worked through the night to capture the significance of what they had witnessed. The consensus was clear. This hadn't been just another royal ceremony, but a moment that had redefined the monarchy's relationship with the modern world. The image of King William's single tear during the crowning ceremony had become iconic within hours of its capture. Newspapers across the globe prepared their front pages with that photograph, recognizing its power to convey the humanity behind the crown. Social media analysts reported that the image had been shared more than any royal photograph in history, crossing cultural and generational lines in ways that surprised even the most. Optimistic palace officials and the private apartments of Buckingham Palace, the newly crowned king, finally allowed himself to relax. The ceremonial robes were carefully stored away by palace staff who understood their historical significance. The crown itself was returned to the Tower of London, where it would wait for the next great state occasion. But the changes the day had brought to William himself were permanent and profound. Catherine found her husband in the nursery, watching their children sleep after the long and extraordinary day. The conversation they shared in those quiet moments would remain private, but palace staff noted the change in both of them the following morning. They carried themselves differently, with a new sense of purpose that reflected their transformed roles as king and queen consort. The international response continued to pour in through the following days. Commonwealth nations that had been considering Republican movements found their populations newly engaged with the monarchy. Opinion polls showed significant increases in support for the royal family, particularly among younger demographics who had connected with the authenticity they had witnessed during the ceremony. Foreign diplomats reported back to their governments that the coronation had demonstrated the British monarchy's continued relevance and soft power. The ceremony had been watched by an estimated 2 billion people worldwide, making it one of the most viewed events in television history. More importantly, the reaction had been overwhelmingly positive, even in countries with complicated relationships. With Britain's colonial past, the economic impact was immediate and substantial. Tourism to Britain spiked as people wanted to visit the places they had seen during the coronation coverage. hotels, restaurants, and attractions across the country benefited from what economists would later term the coronation effect. The ceremony had effectively served as a global advertisement for British culture and heritage. Religious leaders from various faiths praised the ceremony's blend of ancient tradition and contemporary values. The Archbishop of Canterbury received messages from religious figures worldwide, commenting on how the service had demonstrated the continuing relevance of faith-based leadership in an increasingly secular world. The coronation had shown that tradition and modernity could coexist meaningfully. In the weeks that followed, King William began his reign with a series of visits across the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth. But the tone had been set by that moment of genuine emotion during his crowning. Each public appearance reinforced the impression of a monarch who understood both the weight of his responsibilities and the human connections that made them meaningful. The tear that had moved millions became a symbol of a new kind of monarchy, one that honored tradition while embracing authenticity. Royal biographers would later identify the coronation as the moment when the British monarchy successfully navigated its transition into the 21st century, proving that ancient institutions could evolve while maintaining their essential dignity and purpose. Years later, when historians examined the early reign of King William V, they would consistently return to his coronation day as the foundation of his successful monarchy. The genuine emotion he had shown, far from appearing weak, had demonstrated strength of character and emotional intelligence that resonated with people across all walks of life. The legacy of that single tear would endure long after the golden coach was returned to the royal mews and the ceremonial robes were stored in their protective cases. It had shown the world that leadership in the modern age required not just dedication and duty, but the courage to be genuinely human in moments of great responsibility. King William had begun his reign not just as a monarch, but as a man his people could truly respect and follow.